You are once again in the field with Neil. Here we are back out at Squam Farm. It's a little dry right now. We're kind of edging on a drought, so hopefully we get some rain in the next few days, but that hasn't stopped the trees from continuing to bud out. So I'm gonna go encounter Kelly, and we're gonna go see what else is budding around the island this week.
Oh, there she is. Hi, Kelly.
Oh, hi, Neil. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. Botanist in action. Botanist at work.
We're getting a taste of spring, finally.
Ooh.
I've been checking to see when these guys will be blooming. These are red maples. They're one of our most important native trees here, especially in the wet areas and the wooded swamps. You can see it's got a red flower with yellow anthers where the pollen is. This is a male tree, which is kind of cool because you'll have either a tree with all male flowers or a tree with all female flowers.
Oh, okay.
Or
so
you can have a tree that has some of each.
you can see the pollen actually on the tips of each of these anthers, the male part of that.
Yep. And a female tree won't have the pollen. It'll just have red structures, which will be fertilized, and they'll make the samaras, the helicopters, the seeds that people like to play with.
I definitely
and those
play with
those will also be red, and then in the fall the leaves turn red. So it's kind of an interesting tree where its name actually really fits it. It's Acer rubrum in Latin, so it's a red maple in Latin and a red maple in English too.
So I come from New York. The state tree up there is the sugar maple.
Right?
And everybody loves some maple syrup. Can you make syrup from a red maple?
You actually can, and people do, but the sugar content in the sap is lower, so it's really hard to make sugar off maple syrup from a sugar maple, and it's actually even harder to do that with a red maple or a silver maple. You have to have a lot more gallons of sap to make just 1 gallon of syrup, and for a sugar maple it takes about 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup.
And red maple is much harder.
Much more, yeah. And the flavor is not quite as good.
Mm.
And also, we don't really have a snowpack in the winter, so it wouldn't really help with the red maple run.
So red maples are putting on quite the show right now. If you look at the whole canopy, see all of these flowers in bloom. Oh, somebody's doing some good work on the leash. Maybe. I may take another dog home today. So red maples are putting on quite the show. What else do we have? Do we have a lot of other maple trees on the island?
No, we actually don't. The red maple is really our only native maple. There are some that are planted. There's a sycamore maple, which is actually considered invasive, and that was planted because it was salt tolerant, but it tends to spread. And then there are a few Norway maples, also considered invasive, and a few silver maples, which are native to the region but not to Nantucket.
Wow.
But if you see a maple and you're out in the woods, and it's especially if it's a swampy area, this is actually kind of a dry area for red maple on Nantucket, but usually it'll be in a swampy area with sphagnum moss and a pool. Then it's a good bet that it's probably a red maple.
And so this is a very hardy, resilient tree. Can go more into the southern U.S. than its relative, the sugar maple, right?
Yeah, this tree can go all the way down into Texas, and there are a few different varieties. And it's also really adaptable to different soil conditions, like acidic soil, low nutrient soil, which is perfect because that's what we have on Nantucket. We have a lot of sandy, really impoverished soils, not much calcium, magnesium. Those are things that the sugar maple really needs. And then the temperature range, it can just take a lot of different temperatures. It's considered a generalist. A lot of forest and uplands, you see it everywhere growing throughout the forest, especially after logging, it'll come in. But here it's mostly a tree of wetland areas, so this is kind of an unusual stand because it's not a really wet area.
And some red maples I've seen around the island, they'll put up like vertical shoots. Once they blow down, they'll put up some vertical shoots to like
Yeah, they're really good at tipping over and then not dying. That's something I wrote about in my last blog article about how they'll be tipped over in a really bad storm because they're usually growing in a waterlogged soil. They don't really have the really deep root system, and they just aren't really the type of tree to have a really deep taproot and a deep root system. So they'll get ripped out of the ground and they'll tip over, but they're still part of it rooted, and they're just well adapted to just send up new trunks. So they'll do that from the old trunk, or they'll do that from the root ball. and they just kind of resurrect themselves over and over again as they get toppled.
So to live on islands, you know, hardy people and hardy plants as well.
Definitely, definitely. And you know, that's their compromise, is that they can live in these really wet areas where the other trees can't. We don't really have any other swamp tree species here that can really be in the wet habitats, but they have to be able to deal with the windy conditions, and that's what they do.
Very cool. Here is one of those red maples that has unfortunately had a nice big accident from a wind blow. So Kelly, what's going on here with
Yeah,
this?
so it's just like I was talking about, where the whole root plate gets ripped out of the ground. You can see most of the roots are really close to the surface, even though the red maple is really adapted to having soggy bottoms and wet
Soggy
roots. Soggy bottoms. And they call it wet feet in the horticultural industry when plants are in the water all the time. It still needs to have roots near the surface so they can get enough oxygen exchange, otherwise they'll die. So the roots are pretty close to the surface, and when there's a big storm and there's a lot of water in the ground, it makes the mud really not very solid. And they'll peel upward and tip over, and it's called a tip-up mound because it's tipped up. And then you can see where a few years after this has happened, you've got new trunks that are forming, and they're growing right out of the base of the tree, or sometimes they'll just grow vertically up from the trunk. And it's the same individual, so it's just kind of tipped over, and the same individual is carrying on. It's not actually dead, and it's not seedlings, it's actually part of the same individual.
Interesting. So it's growing up some new shoots, and it's going to leaf out this year and hopefully capture as much sun
Yeah,
as it can.
yeah, it'll be fine. They just tip over and they keep on going. It's rare for them to actually die here, at least. I think because the soil is so wet, and in these wetlands, it's actually a richer type of soil. You can see where it peeled away, it created a nice deep pool, and it's 2 or 3 feet deep. And this is really great habitat for all of our amphibians and our spotted turtles. They really love these tip-ups. They can get down under the roots and they'll find a hollow to hide in over the winter. And Danielle has done a lot of turtle research out here and at Madawi and now at Windswept. And she's found that turtles find these areas and they get a really good spot, and there'll be like a pile of turtles under the water, under the tree roots. And it protects them like a cage because of all the roots, so predators can't easily get in there. And then they're under the water, so they're at constant temperature through the winter, and they can breathe through their skin, so for their cloaca.
Yes.
So they can be safe for the winter underneath.
And we don't have too many of the big pool breeding salamanders on island. Our redback salamanders are terrestrial breeders that make a little den
Right.
underneath logs. But four-toed salamanders, which we do have on island, will utilize these pools.
Right. They like the areas that you can sort of see in the distance with mossy hummocks of sphagnum moss. And they like to make a nest inside the sphagnum moss where it's nice and safe and cool and wet. And the female will lay her eggs there, and then the little baby salamanders will drop into the water and complete their life cycle. But on the mainland, there are a lot of species of salamanders that lay their eggs directly in the pools as gelatinous masses of eggs. And we just don't have that here. We don't have newts, and we don't have any of the spotted salamanders.
It makes me sad. I miss the newts.
I know. We really need newts. This forest would be great for newts. But when the whole island was deforested, if we had newts, they probably disappeared. And it's possible we had some of these forest creatures and they just weren't able to cope with deforestation.
Amphibians are too cute. Like I want more. Give me toads. Give me newts.
Right.
I love them.
Not to mention things like chipmunks and baby toads.
Yeah, we're missing a lot of things that the mainland has in full effect.
Yes.
Some things that we're glad for, like skunks, foxes, raccoons, coyotes.
True. Yeah, so in addition to being a really good habitat for the turtles, you can see all the moss that's growing all over this. There's lots of moss and lichen and some liverworts. And the older the trees are, the more diversity they pick up with the fungi and all this biodiversity.
So these are probably Trimides species of fungi that are growing in the little shelves.
Yep. Yeah, and we've got whole lots of variety here.
Neat.
Yeah, so the tree is kind of an engineer for this habitat for the spotted turtles and for the other creatures that need the vernal pools, because every time one gets tipped over and ripped out of the ground, it creates a little pond.
Creates a
So
little
it's
micro
kind of an
habitat.
ongoing thing, and then there'll be a mound where the tree roots actually eventually rot down into the soil. So you end up with a whole series of pits and mounds and pools throughout the whole area, and that's what Squam Swamp and parts of Squam Farm are like.
So we need a little bit of that diversity, some of that, you know, difference.
Yep, and the
homogeneity.
disturbance of having, you know,
Heterogeneity.
wind and weather, having trees that actually tip over like this creates the little pools that they love.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Super cool. Thanks for showing us that, Kelly.
Yeah, no problem.
Anyone who wants to learn more about red maples and how resilient and amazing they are, go read Kelly's blog article and stay tuned for some more fun exploration of the flora of Nantucket.